I just want to mention tonight's shiur is in the continued Refuah Shalema, B'ezrat Hashem. Harvey Kasdan is doing very well, and now he's home from the hospital. His name is Chaim Ari ben Rifkin. He should have a complete recovery.
Okay, amen, amen. All right, Baruch Hashem, hope everyone is well and getting ready for Rosh Hashanah in a positive and constructive way. Normally, this year we try to focus on the Haftorahs. I'm departing a little bit because of the season of the Yomim Noraim and the fact that the Haftorahs are all dealing with a single theme of comfort, which we had already explored. So I want to focus today on something in the Parsha that's morally very problematical, extremely difficult to understand. And I'm not going to explore the moral problem, although I'll identify it. I want to move in a different direction. And that is, this is Parshat Ki Teitzei, and you might know that of all of the Parshiot in the Torah, this has the most mitzvos. This has, depending on the count exactly, between 55 and 70 mitzvot of the 613 mitzvos of the Torah. That is a huge, huge, huge percentage of the mitzvot of the Torah. So obviously there's plenty of halacha in this Parsha to go through. But the very first mitzvah in the Parsha is a peculiarly a difficult mitzvah to get the ethical sense of, and that is the halacha that pertains to the captive woman in times of war. The Torah seems to say that you capture a person, you capture a woman in time of war, you have intercourse with her the first time, you get a free pass, but afterwards, if you want to stay with her, there's a certain ritual that must be performed. The ritual is essentially designed to discourage you from wanting to be with her. You have to let her fingernails grow long. You have to shave off her hair. She wears the garments of captivity, whatever that would mean exactly. She cries for her father and her mother for 30 days. And only afterwards are you allowed to marry her, stay married to her. And if you decide not to marry her, you must set her free. You cannot continue to own her as a slave because you initially abused her by the initial intercourse. If you were to simply take her as a slave, you could keep her as a slave. But once you went ahead and had relations with her, the only two options are she either gets freedom or she becomes your wife. And obviously the Torah prefers the freedom option because the Torah says you have to go through a ritual to make her unattractive and thereby more likely to be sent away.
Question?
Yeah.
Inasmuch as, except in the cases of the imahot, intercourse in Tanakh always results in pregnancy, don't we have to assume that she's already pregnant?
Well, not necessarily. Not everybody gets pregnant every time, but certainly the Talmud discusses at great length the problem of the child that you may get from such a relationship, and the Gemara indicates that these children will often be not very, very good children because of the improper circumstances by which they were raised.
Or conceived.
Or conceived, yes.
But then what about those children? Do you have any responsibility for those children in the case where you decide not to marry her?
Well, that's a complicated issue because essentially you obviously have responsibilities for your children. But the problem basically becomes if this woman is a non-Jew, if a Jewish man, let's forget about slavery for a moment, if a Jewish man has intercourse with a non-Jewish woman, under the laws of matrilineal descent, not only are those children not Jewish, they are halachically not related to their Jewish father. People don't realize that matrilineal descent is not only an issue of religion, it also is an issue of parentage. Technically, a Jewish man does not have paternity over the children that he has from a non-Jewish woman. Now that would mean, from a strict halachic standpoint, the obligations of a parent to a child would not exist. Now certainly, if we look at the morality of it, if we look at going beyond the letter of the law and embracing the spirit, there is no doubt that a person has a moral obligation in God's book to take care of the children that he brought into the world. But as a technical matter, he is not the halachic father. These children do not have a halachic father. It's quite interesting. People don't realize this. People think matrilineal descent is simply a religious thing. Are you Jewish? Are you not Jewish? It is actually a definition of paternity. Now, this whole Parsha is rife with ethical difficulties. Number one, this initial encounter, the free bite at the apple. Are we talking about rape here? Or in other words, is the Torah legitimating rape in time of war as long as you limit it to one time? Is that what we're talking about? Or are we talking about consensual relationship? Right? So the first time is a real big problem. Besides the fact that even if it's consensual, obviously there's something that's sinful in being with a non-Jewish woman. But the question is, rape or consent? The second issue that you have to figure out is, even the continuation of the process is very difficult. You're given the option to marry her if you put her through the ritual. Well, is that against her will? Is that she wants it? Did she become Jewish or did she remain non-Jewish? Meaning, there are so many unanswered questions here, both in terms of the initial rape and in terms of the continuation of the relationship. I mean, the one thing that's clear is, if you're not going to marry her, she gets her freedom. Okay, that sounds good. But the nature of the marriage and the nature of her conversion, and whether that's coercive or whether it's voluntary, it's not entirely clear. And in fact, if it's entirely voluntary, why do you need the ritual to begin with? I mean, let's just assume that she, for whatever crazy reason, she genuinely wants to convert to Judaism. There'd be no reason to go through a whole ritual of cutting off of shaving her hair and the like. So Yifat Toar is an extremely problematical issue. The one thing that I do want to share with you is there is at least one source, and only one that I know of, that does make explicit that the first bite at the apple, so to speak, is a consensual thing and not a rape. And the Parsha of Yifat Toar should not be seen as any type of legitimation of rape in time of war. Now, it still is a concession, because obviously being with a non-Jewish woman is generally sinful. But here, Chazal give a very interesting and unusual insight. They say the Torah made a concession to the Yetzer Hara, and that is, in time of war, passions are very inflamed, they're very excited. It is difficult to control oneself, and the concept would be that if the Torah would not give some type of outlet for these passions, then it's quite likely it would break out in even a worse, more virulent type of form. So the Torah, in a sense, is permitting a certain measure of sin in order that it should not lead to violations that might be a lot worse. Now, normally, that's not the way the Torah works. Normally, the Torah works with its own system of values and prohibitions, and if you live by them, that's great, and if you can't, if you don't, you don't. Here, this is a very rare instance of the Torah actually allowing, albeit discouraging, something that would normally be sinful in order to permit an outlet to prevent something from being worse, without defining what that worst thing would be. Perhaps the worst thing would be rape, who knows what it would be, murder, and the like. So I'm the first to admit that Eshet Yifat Toar is an ethically very, very challenging issue. War, in many ways, is almost an alternative universe, and although it is true that one must try to maintain an ethical standard even in time of war, and of course the IDF is really very, very exceptional in that standard, really probably the most ethically conscious army in the world, but still there are going to be system failures, and Yifat Toar is one of those failures that the Torah is trying to adjust and modify and prevent from becoming something worse. So I acknowledge that those are very, very serious questions, and I'm not going to talk about them tonight, because I just want to share with you an allegory of the Arizal, which is very, very far afield from Pshuto Shel Mikra, from the simple sense of the verse, but it's very, very relevant to the month of Elul. And that is, the Arizal says the following, that the whole Yifat Toar can be understood not merely as a particular halacha of wartime, which has many ethical difficulties, but as an allegory of the journey of the soul on earth. And it begins this way. The language of the pasuk is, Ki Teitzei la milchama al oyevecha. When you go out to war against your enemy, unisano Hashem Elokecha biyadecha, and God will deliver that enemy into your hands, vishavita shivyo, and you will capture that captivity. You will have captives in time of war. So the Arizal says, who is your true enemy? What is the greatest enemy in your existence? That is the Yetzer Hara. That is the passion within you that tries to take you away from godliness by focusing on hedonism, pleasure, short-term gain, arrogance, anger, all of those bad midot that are the coming from this Yetzer Hara. So the Torah is giving you the following promise. If you truly engage in war against your true enemy, God promises you will have a measure of success. Vishavita shivyo, you will capture from the Yetzer Hara that which the Yetzer Hara has captured from you. The Yetzer Hara has hijacked much of what is good in a person and has diverted it to improper ends. But if you truly, truly want to fight this Yetzer Hara, Hashem will give you the strength to overcome these temptations. And then it goes on and says, and you see in captivity a beautiful woman, Eshet Yifat Toar. So the Arizal brings from the Zohar that the phrase Eshet Yifat Toar is a reference to one's neshama. One's neshama is full of beauty, full of radiance, full of goodness, full of potential. But it gets captured, it gets hijacked. And you see and you want to get it back. You want to get back to your good self. So what do? So this is the ritual. You shave off her hair. You let her fingernails grow very long. So the Arizal says, shaving off the hair is a symbolic gesture of divesting your head, divesting your mind of all the false ideologies and thoughts that take a person away from God. Get rid of it. Divest yourself of the false ideologies. What is letting the fingernails grow long? What do we do with our hands? We grasp things, right? So the hands are material pleasures, acquisitions. When your fingernails are very, very long, you become disabled from grasping. So consequently, the reclamation process of this Eshet Yifat Toar is, number one, trying to divest yourself of false ideologies and false ideas. And number two, trying to divest yourself of materialism and hedonism in an extreme way that takes a person away from spirituality. And then it says she cries for her father and her mother 30 days. So father and mother. Father is God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Mother is Jewish people. It's as if to say that I, as a Jew, am a product of my relationship to God and my relationship to Klal Yisrael. And God is Dad, is Abba, and Klal Yisrael is Ima. Because when a person lives a life of sin and rebelliousness, they are betraying HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And they are also betraying the Jewish people as a whole. Because after all, as the old saying goes, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And if you're part of a chain that goes back 5,000 years from Avram Avinu, actually not that, well, Avram Avinu was born in 1948, so whatever it is, 5778 minus 1948, Avram Avinu, then in a sense you're just breaking that chain. A Jew that rejects God, rejects Torah, is giving Hitler a posthumous victory in many ways. Hitler tried to destroy the Jewish people. Hitler did tremendous, tremendous damage, but he could not destroy. In fact, it's such an interesting irony that Hitler was so confident, at some point at least, that he would wipe out Am Yisrael, that he was concerned that nobody would even know there was a Jewish people, and therefore his great victory would not be celebrated. So do you know that he collected vast amounts of Judaica, and he wanted to create a museum in Prague that would be the museum of this extinct people known as the Jew. Now, interesting that because of all those artifacts were collected and preserved, so I remember around 25 years ago, the Smithsonian in Washington had an exhibit of that stuff. It was called The Precious Legacy, and it traveled around several places in the United States. And this was actually Hitler's museum of the success of the Holocaust. Again, some interesting things in it. But Baruch Hashem, Hitler did not succeed. But once again, we can do to ourselves what Hitler was not able to do. And therefore, a person, the neshama, must cry for the betrayal of the father, which is God, and the mother, which is Am Yisrael. And then it says, for 30 days, the Arizal says this is a remez to the 30 days of the month of Elul. Actually, Elul only has 29 days, but apparently we're rounding it off. The 30 days of the month of Elul, which are set aside for repentance and introspection and spiritual accounting. V'achar kain, and after you've gone through this process, you are ready to be united, reunited with the holy essence of your soul. And I'm just continuing the psukim. And if you don't want, if you basically don't want to go through this process, then set your soul free, do not abuse her, which means to say, what that means exactly is a bit tricky, but I think what the Arizal is suggesting is that it's important to be honest with yourself, even in your rebellion. That if you reject the spiritual will of God, then reject it. Don't define what you're doing as godliness. An example might be, again, with the issue of gay marriage. The Torah prohibits homosexual relations, and sometimes people do it. But you see from the Midrashim that it's much worse to make a sin a mitzvah than it is to treat it as a sin. Meaning to say, if you're going to sin, be honest with yourself that you're sinning. Do not define it as a holy act. So that's why the Midrash tells us that Sodom, that was destroyed for sodomy, among other sins, was not destroyed because of the practice of sodomy, but they were destroyed because they legitimated the practice by writing a ketubah and having a marriage ceremony. This is actually the Midrash itself. So that's what it means. Set your soul free. Do not abuse your soul by trying to make the argument that what you're doing is holy and good. Did you want to say something? Yeah. Did you want to say something? Or?
Oh, yeah.
No.
I have a question. Where do we find this in the Torah? Because when I read it, it says, if you want her, you see her, you want her, you can take her to your home. Yeah? You have to go through the process, and then you're allowed to enter her. It's not that you have to enter her in the beginning and then take her to your home.
Okay, so the truth of the matter is, that there is a very, very big machlokas, an argument among in the Talmud itself regarding how you understand it. I was presenting Rashi's view. Rashi's view is there is one free bite at the apple, so to speak. You are 100% correct. I should have mentioned it. There are many other commentaries who basically say nothing is permitted until you go through this process. So in Maseches Kedushin, you will see different opinions. I understand that the second view, the view that you just presented, makes it a little easier for us because we're not dealing with any type of initial contact. But even then, the ethical problems don't go away because it's still not clear whether she has to consent to anything, even if it happens later. So you're still going to have some type of problem. So the Arizal turns what is an ethically problematical Parsha into a very, very beautiful, mystical, allegory about reclaiming your soul through the process of intellectual contemplation, divestment from materialism, and spiritual honesty, including tears, crying, emotional catharsis, and locating it, situating this experience, b'dafka in the month of Elul, which is the 30 days.
One question.
Yeah.
I know without distracting from our intention,
Yes.
not to get too involved in this.
Well, it's a hard, there's a lot of questions.
But
Yeah.
does the Jewish, during the 30 days, does he have to support her?
Yes, 100%. He does have to support her. Yeah.
So doesn't this operate as a very strong emotional inducement not to rape her? I mean, I've never committed rape, so I don't know quite the mentality of the rapist, but my understanding is that he wants to have his way with her and then get rid of her. Get her out of his life and goodbye.
You're 100% correct, and that indeed could be part of the psychology of the institution, meaning to say, the Torah gives you permission, but then says there are going to be consequences to your decision, and there indeed could very well be a hope that as a result of those consequences you're going to desist. Now, it's not going to work in all cases, obviously, but in some cases it will. So the post, well, again, I don't know whether it's rape is a question, but whatever it is, the consequences of his action may in fact be a deterrent in undertaking the action to begin with. That's exactly right.
Don't we see this in the case of Tamar and who was the son of David?
Amnon, yeah, they were half brother and
Yeah,
sister.
it was a
Yeah.
case of a rape, and afterwards he wanted nothing to do with her.
That's correct.
That,
Well, that's correct. Rape is not an act of love. Rape is an act of violence. That's well established. So there's no particular reason why a rapist wants to hang around with the victim afterwards. In fact, this is another unusual law of the Torah, which I'm not going to talk about, but I'll mention because, again, you could think about this and discuss it. The Torah basically says that if a man rapes a woman, he is obligated to marry her, and he may not divorce her. Now, there it is clear that she has the right to say no. She does have the right to say no. She is not forced into this marriage by any means. But it's a very peculiar rhetoric because it's making the assumption that she would want to have some type of demand that he marry her, and the Torah says yes. And the way we typically look at rape, we could not imagine in a 1,000 years that God forbid, the rape victim would want to actually marry the guy. But apparently,
She must torture him the rest of his life.
Torture him. Well, okay. Say again? He did. Yeah. Well, you're right. You're right. Yes, we have one case where he literally wanted to, and she, of course, she went along with it too. Okay. So it's a little strange. Some of the difficulties sometimes in biblical narrative is it's hard for us to capture the mindset of ancient society. So although the Torah's wisdom is eternal, but sometimes the way the characters behave, they're situated in history, in a particular time and place, and we just can't put ourselves there. We don't quite understand the mentality. But apparently there was a notion that a rape victim would sometimes demand that she be taken care of because she was damaged goods or whatever the perception was, and therefore he said, what do they say in this? I don't want to make light of this, but you broke it, you pay for it, meaning to say, you damaged me, you take responsibility, which is a very, very foreign idea to contemporary sensibility. So again, another thing I'm not going to address that you can think about and the like. Okay, did you want to say? Yeah.
Just one simple question. You mentioned
Speak louder.
the nails,
Yes.
and the hair.
Yes.
And what about the clothes? Like, Shlomo removed the garment of her captivity. What does it mean?
Right. So in terms of the Yetzer Hara, that means clothing is that which covers up your true self, right? Your true self is you, and the clothing is a barrier that covers you up. So it says remove those blockages, remove those inhibitions towards expressing your relationship with Hashem. don't allow yourself to be covered up and blocked in many ways. Yeah, in fact, if I could digress for a moment on that, I may have mentioned this, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, forgive me for repeating. Did I mention, I don't know if you remember, Rav Nachman of Breslov's story about the prince that thought he was a turkey? Okay, I mentioned, okay, so I won't repeat that, okay. All right, in any event, this is the Arizal, and it's also brought by the commentary, the Or HaChaim. This is the allegory of the Eshet Yifat Tohar. Okay, so now I want to switch lenses and go back to the halachic part of it and give a comment of Rashi. Rashi has a very unusual halachic comment, which is not his own. He got it from the Medrash, and that is the following. What type of war is this halacha of Yifat Tohar talking about? Because halacha recognizes two types of wars. There is a war, two types of legitimate wars. There is what is called milchemet mitzvah, a war which there is a mitzvah to fight. And then there are milchamot that are called milchemet reshut, optional wars, non-mitzvah wars. What is a mitzvah war? So there are 3 or perhaps 4 categories of wars that are mitzvah wars. One is the war against Amalek, if you can identify them. The other is the war against the 7 nations of Canaan, which are extinct, but the original 7 indigenous nations. The third category, which is unfortunately very much alive today, and those are virtually all of the wars, really all of the wars of the state of Israel, is a war of defense to protect the Jewish people and the land of Israel from enemies who want to destroy it. So whether they're Palestinians, Iran, whatever it would be, generally speaking, the defensive wars of Medinat Yisrael are classified as mitzvah wars. They are not optional wars, they are mitzvah wars. Now that itself has a very interesting implication, which once again I'm going to mention and I'm not going to address because it's not the subject, but I throw out things for you to give you homework to think about. And that is, we read last week people that are exempt from fighting wars, people that just got married, etc., just had a vineyard. So the Mishnah says that only exempts them from optional wars. And I'll discuss what is an optional war. But for a mitzvah war, hakol yotzin, everybody must fight. We take the chatan from his private yichud room. We even take the kala from under the chuppah, meaning even women, it seems. Now, this does raise an enormously interesting and controversial question regarding the propriety of the exemption of students of Torah from military service. We know that one of the controversial issues, the law has changed it, but indeed a controversy that the state of Israel has faced really since 1948 is the exemption for students of Torah, and actually not only for students of Torah, but even for Haredi, different religious sensibilities, from military service. Now, the problem, which I'm not going to address fully, is simply this. If we assume, and this seems to be correct, that the milchamot of Medinat Yisrael are milchamot mitzvah, because they fall under the third category, to protect the land and the population from enemies that try to destroy it. And the Mishnah in Maseches Sotah tells us, milchemet mitzvah, there are no exemptions. Then it would stand to reason that nobody, unless they have a physical disability, but no able-bodied person can be exempted or is entitled to an exemption from participation in milchemet mitzvah. So this is not just a shivoy hanatal, this is not just a sociological issue. I mean, the basic problem is, in halacha itself, it would seem that there might not be a basis for any type of exemption, at least if there's a combat necessity. Now again, the counter-argument is that if there's not a necessity, then judgments can be made about other priorities. But in terms of a categorical exemption, there apparently would not be. Again, I don't want to address that either, but that's Milchemet Mitzvah. Now, what is Milchemet Reshut? Just to be sure that, right, so those are mitzvah wars. Now, Milchemet Reshut is a non-defensive war of aggression. Now, that sounds pretty bizarre. Is the halacha telling me that under Torah, a Jewish state can simply declare war against a non-aggressive party simply because we want to conquer their territory? That doesn't sound very moral either. So here you have to understand that the term Milchemet Reshut, optional war, is a bit of a misnomer because there is a protocol that proclamation of that war would entail, and that is, number one, there has to be a melech, which we don't have today. There has to be a Sanhedrin that have to authorize it. But number three, which is most important, there must be prophetic authorization via the divine breastplate that the Kohen Gadol wears, which is another way of saying God has to give you the green light. And it must be done through the medium of prophecy. And therefore, for all intents and purposes, there is no such creature today as Milchemet Reshut. The only wars that are halachically sanctioned today are defensive wars. Now, even then, you get into a lot of interesting questions. Granted, Netanyahu has not been calling up Rabbanim for advice except around election time. But, defensive wars are Milchemet Mitzvah. Offensive wars are not permitted today because we lack the prophetic Reshus. But then you get all sorts of questions regarding preemptive strikes, right? In other words, again, what is a defensive war? Obviously, if the enemy has crossed into our territory, or if the enemy is shooting missiles into our territory, so we can take whatever action. But what if you're talking about preemption, meaning to say, they haven't done anything yet. I want to take a step to go into their territory to disable their resources, prevent a future attack, like all the way back in the 1980s when Israel bombed nuclear reactor in Iraq, etc. So there's no question exactly how preemptive can a defensive war be. I mean, can we, for example, conquer a country because we feel if we don't, in 15 years it'll be, some power against us. So there are going to be definitional issues as to what halacha regards as legitimately defensive in nature. But the basic distinction is fairly clear. Defensive wars are okay. Offensive wars are not unless you have the entire process that you need for Milchemet Reshut, which requires Melech, Sanhedrin, Urim V'Tumim. Okay, Urim V'Tumim is the Kohen Gadol's breastplate, which really means prophecy, that God says yes. Now, why would God say yes? That's an interesting question. Who knows? It could very well be that God might feel, or God knows, that a certain country would do better under Jewish control, but that would be God's decision, so to speak. It wouldn't be a decision that we would be allowed to make. Now, listen to what Rashi says. Rashi says, the Parsha of Eshet Yifat Toar, what type of war is the Torah legitimating this particular thing? Rashi says it's only an optional war, which wouldn't apply today at all. Because if it's a mitzvah war, there would be no possibility, at least if it's the 7 nations of Canaan, of taking a Canaanite captive, because the Torah requires the eradication of the Canaanite captives. And therefore, Yifat Toar only applies in an optional war. Now, I have to admit, I have a problem with this Rashi, because it seems to be there's an undistributed middle here. Because I understand Rashi's point that you can't apply this to the war against Amalek or Canaan because there'll be no captives. But that doesn't exhaust the category of mitzvah wars. The mitzvah war today, there's certainly no mitzvah to eradicate every combatant. So
The opposite.
yeah, that's right. So if that's so, what stops Rashi from extending Yifat Toar to the milchama mitzvah of today, which is defensive. I mean, Rashi's argument that it can't be talking about the mitzvah war because there are no captives only applies to two of the three categories of the mitzvah war. It does not apply to the third. Now, indeed, you might recall, just a few months ago, I think less than a year ago, the Rav Tzavai, the head rabbi of the IDF, did he resign? I don't remember, but there was some issue that as a yeshiva student, he had published an article, just a pilpul article, just a theoretical article, about the various halachot of Eshet Yifat Torah that might be applied in contemporary warfare. And he just did this as an academic exercise. He was not advocating anything at all. And somebody unearthed that old article, and he got in a tremendous amount of trouble. I'm not sure if he resigned and was replaced or something, but at least there was some contemporary discussion about the possibility of Yifat Torah even today. But according to Rashi, it couldn't happen because Rashi says it's only milchemet reshut, it's not milchemet mitzvah, although Rashi's proof seems to be a little problematical. Okay, that is the halachic side of the equation. So now I want to do a little bit of crossing the borders here. And that is, it's a little peculiar. According to the Arizal and the Zohar and the Orach Chaim, the allegory or the story of Yifat Torah is an allegory of the struggle of the person to reclaim his soul from the clutches of the Yetzer Hara. Now, if we were to ask, is that type of milchama akin to a mitzvah war or an optional war, we would certainly classify it as a mitzvah war because, after all, it is the most important duty of my life. So is it not a little analytically peculiar that a story that signifies the fight against the Yetzer Hara should be articulated in a narrative that is very specifically limited to optional war instead of a milchemet mitzvah? Meaning we would have expected that the allegory of the Yetzer Hara belongs in a narrative concerning mitzvah wars and not in a narrative concerning optional wars. So essentially, therefore, the halacha and the allegory are very mismatched because the halachic story is referring to optional wars, and the allegory is the greatest mitzvah I have in my life, to fight the Yetzer Hara. Right? So there's a certain dissonance between the halachic structure of the story, the pshuto shel mikra, the simple meaning of the narrative, and the spiritual message. So a very, very great Rav, not alive anymore, of Shlomo Yosef 7. Again, you may have heard of Rav 7. Rav 7 was, among many, many things, but one of his accomplishments was he was the founding editor of the Encyclopedia Talmudit, the Talmudic Encyclopedia. He was a brilliant, brilliant writer in modern Hebrew. He was a tremendous master of all rabbinic literature, like in a photographic sense. And what was a very, very rare commodity, Rav Zevin was in all circles. He knew Rav Kook very well. He was a younger man. He was connected to Chabad, connected to Mizrahi. He was at Yumi posek. And he was connected to the Brisker Rav, and many of the Gedolim were very much anti-Zionist. So he was connected to everybody. He knew everything. Wonderful, wonderful writer, and a perceptive person with a mastery of Torah, but also a very, very sensitive soul as well. With Shlomo Yosef 7, again, maybe he's not as well known as he should be. Even today, his Sfarim are magnificent. Now, occasionally, I'll just give you an example, of how things get distorted. One of his classic books, which is still one of the best books Sfarim ever written on the Yomim Tovim, is a sefer called Moadim B'Halacha, which is really a halachic overview of the analytical issues of every chag. The shilas, the questions, the rishonim, the achronim. So you can read like in 20 pages, you can get like a summary of all of the major halachic issues of every Yom Tov. Now, Rav Zevin included at the end of his book what he regarded as recent holidays. Yom Ha'atzmaut, and he discusses the halachic issues. Now, Art Scroll saw that Moedim B'Halacha was such a beautiful sefer, which it is, that they commissioned a translation of Moedim B'Halacha. So it's called the Festivals in Halacha. You can get it, they printed it in 2 volumes. It's a translation of Rav Zevin's book. But because Art Scroll's constituency are largely non-Zionist, they just omitted, without indication, a whole chapter of his sefer. They omitted the chapter on Yom Ha'atzmaut. Now, that is a fairly outrageous thing to do. It's one thing to say, to at least indicate, we have not translated this because, that would have been a wrong decision, but at least they're saying we've omitted some things. But to omit part of an author's work when you're translating that work without indicating that something has been omitted is really very inexcusable censorship. And what they said was, they said something that was even worse. They said, well, Reb Zevin wrote this in the early 1950s. If he would have been alive today and would have seen, all the different things that go on, he would have agreed with. How do you know? I mean, you're making an assumption. Okay. But be it as it may, I don't want to, that's just gossip. I don't want to get into that. But here's what Reb Zevin says. Again, what's our question? Our question is, why would the allegory of the Yetzer Hara be situated in a Parsha that's dealing with optional war? Says Reb Zevin, although the Milchemet HaYetzer is certainly a Milchemet Mitzvah, you have to fight it the way you fight a Milchemet Reshut. The tactics of this Milchemet Mitzvah are those of Milchemet Reshut. What do we mean? What is the primary halachic difference between Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut? At least when I say Mitzvah, I don't mean the defensive war, but the Amalek war and the 7 nations. When you're fighting Amalek or the 7 nations, you got to destroy the enemy. When you're fighting optional wars, you capture and reclaim the enemy. Here the lesson is, when a person does tshuva, the optimal way of doing tshuva is not by destroying your past, but by capturing, reclaiming, and sublimating and channeling it in a positive direction. There are 2 types of tshuva. Rav Sobek talks about this as well. There is a tshuva that is akin to an amputation. Person has, God forbid, a gangrenous arm or leg. Sometimes the only choice you have is to amputate it, to cut it off, to disregard it. Otherwise, it will contaminate, poison, infect the rest of the body, and the body will die. That is a tshuva called amputation. But just like physical amputation is a last resort, and even when it's done, it could be accompanied with a lot of phantom pain, which can be extremely, phantom pain is not a joke, it can be extremely painful. So too, when we try to simply forget our past comes back to haunt us. We can't really disengage. Again, if any of you have read The Great Gatsby, essentially, The Great Gatsby is a work of potential tshuva, which got frustrated essentially for someone who tried to escape a past, and the past came back and it eventually destroyed him in some ways.
No, they didn't come back.
Huh?
In the book,
Well,
he was a bootlegger.
Yeah, but it was
And
a kind of, he tried to create a new identity, but the point basically was that what he was dragged him down. Well, again, I mean,
Oh, yes.
yeah.
Through the accusations
Right.
of
Things
of
came
Tom,
out, exposed, etc.
of
Yeah.
the husband of the woman that he
Right,
wanted.
Nick, yeah, that's right. Tom and Daisy, right. So, be it as it may, therefore, the higher level of tshuva is not to destroy who you were, but to take that past and use it as the source of your unique strengths. Now again, let me give you a simple example. Let's take a drug addict. Let's say a person was an alcoholic or a drug addict for many, many years. And now they finally do tshuva, they're able to change their lives. Now, one way of dealing with the 10, 20, or 30 years of dysfunctional behavior is to simply make believe they never exist. Don't think about it. Get away from it. But you know, as they say, that's very difficult. That's amputation. And that still leaves you with the idea that those years were a waste. Now, let's assume that instead of just ignoring that past, the person uses the very negativities of his experience as his basis for helping people. He becomes a drug counselor, an alcohol counselor. That is not obliterating his sin. That is taking his sin and using it as the source of the positive energy of growth in which the sin itself becomes redeemed by being the foundation of his avoda. This is the tactic of the optional war, in which you capture the enemy rather than obliterate it. Now, this is something that people who are Balei Tshuva often have to go through. You know, you come to Yerushalayim and you meet people who are, 10th generation Yerushalmis, they come from 50 generations of rabbis. And you come from North Dakota or Montana, and you've been religious, for 6 months or whatever it is. And you realize that no matter what I do, I'll never be, I won't even be, as educated as the 5th grader of this family. But here is the secret that a person needs to know. It is true that the 10th generation Yerushalmi has many, many gifts that I will never have. But it's also true that the person from North Dakota has many gifts that Yerushalmi is never going to have. Because Hashem decided where our souls would be born. And at least before we were capable of making decisions, what our environments would be. And if he put us in a certain environment, and if we went through a certain journey, that is because God decided that will be the source of the uniqueness of our contribution in the world. This is the tshuva, not of amputation, not of being ashamed of who you are, not escaping who you are, but embracing that past and using it in a positive way, in a way that you couldn't have done had you not gone through those experiences. And that's why people often, when they become religious, they often abandon the talents that they had, whether it's music or art or whatever it is. They often cut off family ties. Again, these are things that I know firsthand from dealing with people in these situations. And sometimes that may be the way to go, because sometimes you have to amputate when there are toxic, destructive relationships. I don't deny the reality of that. But that's a last resort, and that is not the goal of tshuva, which involves reclaiming yourself and not obliterating yourself. So the fight of the Yetzer Hara is a mitzvah war, but you fight it like an optional war in terms of capturing rather than destroying. And this is the meaning of a very enigmatic passage in the Gemara, where the Gemara says, when you do tshuva out of love, God does not just erase your sins, but your sins are credited as if they are commandments, as if they're mitzvot. How can my sin become a mitzvah? I understand God forgives, God erases. That itself is a phenomenal kindness of the Almighty. Like, I shouldn't even say I understand that. That itself is a tremendous chesed. But I understand that takes me down to zero. I had 1 million sins. God erases them. I start with a clean slate. Baruch Hashem. But a clean slate means zero in my bank account. But the Gemara says much more than that. When you do tshuva out of love of God, you don't simply have a clean slate. All of those deficits are now positives. Rabbi Yitzchak of Breitowitz went over to the town Russia, and and said, I'm so jealous of you. All you have to do is tshuva out of love, and you're going to be way ahead of me. All of your aveirot are going to be mitzvah. But how can that be? That's very strange. And aveira becomes a mitzvah. The answer is yes, because when you use all of those negative experiences as the basis of the creative energy that you bring to God, God looks at all of those actions as kind of the prep work, the preliminary work to get you where you were. You see, if all you're doing is amputation, you're not going to be credited with any of that because you're just getting rid of it. When you use it, it actually becomes part of your mitzvah identity. So this issue about cutting off family, cutting off interests, this is why, by the way, you often find in the religious world a certain measure, maybe I would call it a subclinical level of depression. Again, I'm not referring to clinical depression, but just a certain malaise, a lack of joy, a lack of enthusiasm. Because everybody's afraid to be themselves a little bit because other people will look, it's not done, this isn't done, that isn't done, everything's a fear, this isn't done, that isn't done, etc. I've heard stories about people who took out the garbage not wearing a jacket, and they said it affected, I don't know if these are true, but it affected the shidduch for their daughters, all of these different things. People are watching you all the time, different communities. And the point is, when you're not yourself, you're cutting yourself off from whom you are, there is going to be something not natural about that. That's going to be painful. That's going to cause a certain pain. It may not be acute pain, but at least this, what you might call a subclinical, certain depression in life, that you're just not expressing yourself. And we don't believe that the talents and the abilities that God gave you are evil things that you're supposed to fight and deny and destroy. But rather you use them and you elevate them and you consecrate them, and they become the source of your strength and the source of your contribution. So again, I'm elaborating on Rav Zevin, but this is Rav Zevin's beautiful, beautiful insight, that the war of the Yetzer Hara must be fought like an optional war, where the enemy is caught and reclaimed, and not like a mitzvah war, where the enemy is obliterated. The great Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, who died a few years ago, his story is very well known. Chicago boy, raised in Chicago. He went to a co-ed high school. He was on the basketball team. He was a debater. Although he came from a religious family, he was not a Baal Tshuva, but he grew up in an environment which is decidedly not the yeshivish environment of the Mir Yeshiva. And of course, he's related to the Mir Rosh Yeshiva, but he grew up to become who he became. And of course, he is a very heroic figure because he suffered debilitating illness, multiple sclerosis, absolutely debilitating illnesses, and he pushed himself onward and onward. I mean, he was a very, very heroic person in that way. But I remember attending the Levaya, and there were a lot of eulogies, and all of the eulogies made the same point, which I was a little offended at. And the point was, look at how a person can escape the limitations of his environment. He grew up in such a tamei environment, co-ed high school, basketball team, like a garbage environment. And look at how he was able to reject that environment and become what he became. Right? That was kind of the dominant chord of the eulogies. But I would suggest to you that there's something missing from that picture. He did not become who he became in spite of his environment. He became who he became because of his environment. Because one of his very exceptional qualities, of many exceptional qualities, was his ability to relate well with American teenagers. And he would often talk to American, even middle school kids. He would talk to them and he would say, listen, I played basketball. I was in a co-ed school. He understood, and he had a sensitivity to people. and a receptivity to people, because in his life experiences, he was exposed to many, many different things. So instead of simply saying he rejected that life to become something better, he took those experiences and he assimilated them into his religious identity in a very positive and constructive. Now, granted, those were not sinful. I'm not suggesting anything was sinful there, but just the idea that even things that were regarded as off the beaten track or not conventional within the yeshivish world, they were part of his positive identity. So the issue was not, oh, look at how a person can escape from such a bad thing. It's the other way around. He took those experiences and he made them the source of something very positive and very deep. And that is how we have to be as well. Whether we come from Montana, North Dakota, different types of family circumstances, different types of difficulties and trials. These are not things to be ashamed of. These are the victories in life that made us who we are, and they bring out the unique qualities that we have in Avodat Hashem. They don't have to be spoken about to other people if you don't want to talk about them. Nobody's saying you have to publicize every single event in your life. But at least internally, they are our victories in life that make us who we are. And therefore our job is to use them as a source of positive spiritual energy rather than simply amputate and ignore what they represent. And this is why the allegory of the Yetzer Hara is bedafka in the Parsha of Milchemet Rosh Hashanah. This is an elaboration on the thought of the great Rav Shlomo Yosef 7. So have a good night and a good week and a good Chodesh.
Thank you.
It's